Okay, so thanks for sacrificing some time today, this beautiful day here, and to learn a little bit about this wonderful gift that's being given to your institution, to your community here. And it's my pleasure, on behalf of the donor, to deliver it to you and to tell you a little bit about it and to hopefully help prepare you to get up to speed to use it effectively in your community. I'm sure that you will. I'm sure on behalf of the donor that he would be very thrilled. He wants to remain anonymous, but he'd be very thrilled to know that you're getting this. I know that he knows we're here today, and so I'd be very excited about hearing about it. So good to have you. My intention in the next probably I'll take 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions. And of course, my teaching style is such that if I bring up something that requires from you a question while I'm doing it, rather than hanging on until the very end, by all means, ask it, and I'll try to respond if I can without getting off track and distracted, and we'll have more of a dialogue than a monologue in here as we move along together. But my hope is to introduce you to this wonderful biblical artifact and to tell you a little bit about it and where it came from and so on and so forth, the kind of work that we've done with it, and then some very unique features about it, which we'll show you on the screen and introduce you to so that you're become more familiar with this. Of course, the Torah, when it's used to refer to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible written in Hebrew, the Jewish Tanakh, the Torah is written in scroll form, always. It's always written without vowels, without punctuation, and with a number of other features that make it unique. And by and large, 99.99999% of them are absolutely identical. There are, by my estimation, in the world today, over 20,000 Torahs. And this is a unique heirloom, as you'll learn, and a legacy for you to be now stewards of as it's come to you in a very unique pathway. The Torah tells us, it's one thing to look at it and say, they're all the same, and to walk away. But when you look at it, if I pulled you next to me at my elbow and we went through and looked at line by line and column by column and compared it with the other 19,999, we'd see that there are a lot of unique features. And there's some things that are very much the same, some things that are unique, and these things scream loudly about how the book was written and preserved over time. It's a wonderful story. It's one thing to say, and important to say, God's Word is truth. The Bible is 100% reliable. I can stake my life and eternity on it, and indeed we can. But it's another thing, and you'll have now the unique opportunity to look at a scroll and to see how it was preserved over time. And this is a very special opportunity. I had mentioned in a previous session, one of the things that our research center does, it supports the work of Ravi Zacharias and Josh McDowell. We're very close with Josh McDowell, and he in his teaching ministry now is going with scrolls and with manuscripts, using those to teach how the Bible was transmitted and preserved over time. And he said that when he came to learn this, he said that it became the most powerful teaching tool that he's ever encountered in 60 years of teaching. He's taught millions of people. So I'd be echoing what he says, that you have a legacy here. You have a tool that will teach you about how the Bible was preserved in a way that you can't learn in any other way than by sitting down and looking at it and observing it and learning about it. So it's a great opportunity. I will out Josh. I was in Dallas with him, and we were helping him with his his book, Evidence That Demands a Verdict, the most recent one that came out with details and facts and fact-checking and things like that. And he's a friend. And he was talking about Hebrew scribes, Jewish scribes. He said they made a mistake. They would take it and they would bury it. They would destroy it. Have you ever heard that before? I see some heads nodding. And, they make a mistake. They do this. They do that. And I had a Torah with me, and I rolled it across his conference table. I said, Josh, come over here. I want to show you something. And I pointed to a column that had multiple corrections. Now, don't be alarmed, because you'll learn that these are okay. And in all the credit to Josh, I don't know if you know Josh McDowell, but like he's very energetic. And he's always got, he's always talking and always teaching, and he was dead silent. And he looked, and his eyes got big, and that was it. He understood it was a more complicated process, but he got the process, and he understood it. And boom, from then on, it transformed how he went about using this as a tool to teach how God's Word has been preserved. So this is good stuff. It really, really is. And by God's good grace in my career, I've had privilege of working with thousands of manuscripts, unknown manuscripts, earliest texts of the New Testament, unknown Dead Sea Scrolls, 77,000 Torah scrolls probably, just all kinds of things. This, to me, if you ask me, what would I use to try to teach students, the general public, what have you, about this story of text transmission, I would choose a Torah, because they're so visceral. I mean, they're large and massive and impressive and awe-inspiring and everything. So they just become a wonderful tool to do that with. We're doing an exhibit with the National Library in Russia and with the Ministry of Culture, and one of the items on exhibit is the Leningrad Codex. That's pretty good. But we have scrolls too and other things that vividly tell the story of how the Bible was preserved and transmitted over time, how it's used in liturgy and how it's used in study and all of this. It's just good stuff. So the Torah, they still produce the Torah this way today. And if it were not for the fact that we're in religious holidays and now we're in Shabbat, I'd call up a sofer who's a friend of mine in Jerusalem, and he'd tell you on speakerphone what he does to produce a scroll, the work that goes into it, how long it takes, and everything else. We know that this was produced. Now they have both, in some communities, male and female. They're called sofer, is the word for scribe. But this was produced by a male who apprenticed for a number of years until they got it down right or took another job. But it could be up to 10 years of training underneath an expert, learning how to write, learning how the skins are prepared and everything is done. A very long and hard process. And then they would produce a Torah about one a year. That's all they do. They write about 2/3 of a column a day because of the details of the decorative features that are on the letters and every letter having to be right and all of that. It's a long, hard process, about a year long in terms of work. First, they have to prepare the skins. Kosher animals, usually in this case it's calf, but it could be goat, it could be sheep, it could be deer. It just depends. And sometimes it was whatever they could get as we analyze the skins, but antelope or something. But here, calf skin. And the skins are prepared by a parchmenter or a tanner. It's a very smelly, dirty process. Time-consuming, difficult. Professors, have your students get skins and make skins. They'll get it. They'll understand the process pretty quickly. You might have them bypass the use of dog dung, which was used to soften the leather. It's little wonder that the rabbis allowed one profession not to go to the synagogue, to the temple. To the temple, not synagogue. And that was the tanner, because they smelled so bad. And it helps us understand a little bit about Simon Peter in Caesarea, visiting the tanner, Simon the tanner. Imagine the stench of that place. This is a smelly, arduous. It takes well over a month to stretch and thin and prepare a single skin. And they have on racks, they'll have a number of them. And so I think we looked in the database, there are 48 skins that are here in your Torah. Those are two halves because the skin splits, so it's 24 animals. All prepared, carefully done. The sofer would originally do that, but then eventually professionals just did that process. When the skin was prepared, then it's trimmed. And then, they vary in size. Someone had mentioned, gee, most of these have 4 columns, but this one has 1, 2, 3, 4, 4. 1, 2, which one had 6? Oh, here it is, yeah. So it was just a fatter calf. That's all. That not the fattened calf, but a fatter calf. So you have the skins are prepared, and once that's done, then they take them, and these are all very carefully sewn. I would have to show you on the edge here. But they would go and they make dots, pinholes, all the way down on the edges. They do it on all the edges. And then they line it with a grid for how many lines per column they're going to write it. And that will vary. Yours is 42 lines. They vary over date and over time, and that's one of the things that's used for knowing what it dates to, is about how many columns, and how many lines, and this kind of stuff. But they pinhole it, and we'll see pictures of that. And then they line it, and you can see the vestiges of the lines running across here, and they write underneath the line. So if you haven't had Hebrew, you should take it. And it looks like it's backwards because they write the other direction, and they write underneath the line, so it all looks wrong to you. Like this slide is wrong, but it's not. So they hang the letters, and they did with Greek and other languages as well. But so that is a feature. And you're looking here at the beginning of Genesis. We'll talk about that in a second. So they prepare the skins. They get them all done and everything. And all of this was done by the same scribe. The handwriting is the same throughout, except where there are corrections. Except there's one place where actually a panel has been replaced in your scroll. And what has happened there is one of two things. Either there was damage to the panel, the original panel that was there, and they replaced it with one from another scroll, rather than copying the whole scroll again. So, or what they did was they did that. That's the only possible solution. So what happens with the Torah scroll, it's prepared here in a minute. They'll write this and carefully do it. And as it's done, they won't sew it together yet. The sewing together is at the very end. They'll take it and they carefully correct it as they're copying it. Now, based on the dating of your scroll, it was copied from a book, an officially printed book. But when we go back a little earlier in time, it was a little more random because they were copying from other scrolls. And then they would correct it from another scroll. And so they had this kind of cross-checking that was done. But the one person would copy the text and then would be given to someone else who would correct the text. Now, my Sofer friend, I say to him, Danny, how many mistakes do you make, when you copy a scroll? He said, on average, about 250. And he said, then my corrector catches another couple hundred. And nowadays, they submit it to a computer that catches more. And the corrections, for the most part, don't be alarmed. They have to do with shapes of letters. So one letter isn't confused with another. Letters can't touch at all. So the ink can bleed in and touch. Everything very, very carefully done. Sometimes they miss a letter or they miss a word, but they correct it. Your Torah has 960 corrections in it. And many of them, not all, but many are indicated by marks in the column. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. This column alone had a call for 9 different corrections that were made. All of these have been tabulated by good folks that work with me in a database. So you got all that done for you to build on for your study and everything. Like I said earlier, you might have someone come in and say, "Ha! 960 errors in your scroll. And you believe that God's word is transmitted without error and true." And the answer to that is very simple. The 960 corrections, 960 corrections, 960 times, they went and made sure that the text was absolutely right. This text is perfect. But it's perfect not because it fell from heaven to Mount Sinai to Zondervan's. It's perfect because a community was invested in this scroll for over a century, making sure it was right over time. And this is a wonderful, I think a beautiful aspect of the process of text transmission and preservation, is that these things, you've heard the joke before, about the monk who, they invented eyeglasses around 1380. So the monk who got the eyeglasses, and he looked at the text and he says, it says celebrate rather than celibate, all right? So one letter difference, big difference. No eyeglasses, carefully working by candlelight, working to correct one another to make sure it was right. This is a living, organic text that is absolutely perfect, but it's absolutely perfect because of everyone who worked on it over time. It's fantastic. And you see, that's the thing that Josh McDowell understood and understands with where he's at with his ministry impacting hundreds of thousands, is that he can translate that to believers to give them confidence, and apologetically to non-believers to answer criticisms they may have about how the text is transmitted over time. But, so very carefully, this text is copied, and like I say, it takes about a year to do. It's very carefully corrected, and as it's read over time, letters that begin to crack, letters that fade, other kinds of little things that are noticed. The scroll is immediately, when there's a problem with it, it's immediately rolled up in the synagogue. They're reading it throughout the year. It's immediately rolled up, it's put aside, they've got 30 days to fix it. If it's not fixed in 30 days, it is declared pasul, which means it's no longer usable in the synagogue. It has to be put aside permanently. And it may be that and usually this is the case, they have compounded issues that they have to take care of. They've got to pay somebody to take care of it. It costs money. The numbers in the synagogues are dwindling. It's the Nazis. You've got all these issues, and they just say, put it away. And they put it aside. A newer one, perfect, is better than an old one that could have problems. So this particular Torah, certainly, we know based on how it was prepared that it dates somewhere between 1860 and 1890. It has a coating on it that is called mashuach, and it's like a thin coat on the front and on the back. And this was a process that was done in that window of time in Europe. This particular Torah was brought to Israel. It's got stamps on it. The synagogue that had it in their possession. Probably what happened before World War II, it wasn't used through World War II. So it was set aside, it was not destroyed. They were able to retrieve it. It survived. This Torah survived the darkest period in human history, and certainly the darkest for Judaism. And here, this has survived, the story that it can tell, that it's been through, and was brought to Israel, and in this case ended up with a synagogue, and then ended up from the synagogue into a private collection. And this, I can tell you for certain with this one, it was owned by the largest private collection of Hebrew-related manuscripts and scrolls in the world. We work closely with scholars that work with their collection from the National Library in Israel, building a database, carefully working with all the anomalies, tracking them so that we can study them and understand these things better, much better, as a basis of paying close attention to them. So it's an exciting process. The scroll, as I said, it's not to be used in a synagogue because it's been deemed potentially untrustworthy because of the cracking of the letters and all. And so it's set aside. So if anybody asks, how can you as a university, a seminary, have something like this, that's how. It was set aside respectfully, and then was in ownership of a synagogue, probably still being used, and then went to this private collection in Jerusalem, and then eventually to the donor, to you all. And you all now are the stewards of this great scroll, and its story, and its legacy. And it now has a new life with you. And so much can be done with it that's exciting, that relates to that. Let me show you some features here. So the beginning of Genesis is almost always begins with a large letter. And it might not seem that large to you, but any little bit, any tiny thing is a big thing with the Hebrew language, as we'll see. These features that you will see are called crowns or tagim. They are decorative. When in the King James it says that not one jot or tittle. They're called tittles. Now, I don't know of any tittles in Dead Sea Scrolls. Tittles, I think, refer to horns. They refer to nodules in the letters themselves. But nevertheless, the idea is that these features, they had some meaning. We don't know what they are. We tag them so we know where they are. But decorative and for emphasis, certainly. And how they're drawn and how they're done varies from time to time, as is the case with some of the letters as well. All right, now, while you have large letters, you also have small letters that occur in the scroll. And usually they're suspended, but here in this scroll they're not. And so we'll see other ones as well. And where large ones appear and where small ones appear, we're not really sure what's going on there. Emmanuel Tove, who's a specialist who published the Dead Sea Scrolls, the general editor of the Scrolls of the Judean Desert, suggests that it may have something to do with interpretation of the passage, and to draw the attention of the reader to the passage itself, to pay closer attention either in a positive way or a negative way to the passage. That's what he has suggested. So here we have another small letter here that you can see. We have writing that's in the margin, sometimes above the columns. Sometimes there are calls for corrections or how much time it takes to correct something, what have you. That's quite common to find writing in a Torah scroll around the white space. You might think they're not notes, as in like a Bible notes or something. They're comments made by correctors to keep the Torah correct so it can be used. All right. See another small letter here. See Here, the small letter, large. Some letters are dotted. This goes back to practice. It goes all the way back to the scrolls of the Judean desert where letters are dotted as well. So, again, we're not clear as to why they're doing it, but it seems to be hermeneutical, has something to do with interpretation. And these practices, and I'll give you some more specific examples, these practices practices that are found in your Torah from 1860 go all the way back to the time of Jesus in the way they produce the Torah then. So they're the same way and approach and so forth as these traditions were maintained over time. And that's very exciting. There are places in the text that are paginated differently. You'll notice that there are paragraph breaks for sections. This particular section is laid out. It's this Exodus 15, the Song of the Sea, and there are two explanations. It's a poem, so it's laid out differently, but a song. There are two explanations. One would be that it represents the sea that's parted with the Israelites passing through. Another might be that it's laid out in a brick formation so as to have a kind of wall that cannot be pushed over, that the truth of this is impenetrable. It's sturdy. It's foundational, which is interesting. They got these kind of, in their pagination, perhaps images that evoke an understanding of the passage. You'll notice elongated letters. They're justifying the margins, okay? And so they're doing this, and it's clear in this they have 3 columns, and they've got to keep it all together. But you'll see it as well, like here, like here, like here. It'll be on the left-hand side of the margin, and they're doing that because they want to stay in step with the scroll or the book that they're copying. If they get off, if all of a sudden you're copying and now you're at a half a line where it breaks and not at the end of the line, it's very susceptible to make a mistake. Skipping a line, doing this. So what they'll do, if they don't apportion the size of their letters right, they'll just stretch the ones on the end so they end in the right place. So that's what's going on there. Other places, common for pagination of unique layout is the 10 Commandments here in Exodus. And so that's what you have here. By the way, the divine name, I guess I'll show you some other examples that you can see, is always has special decorative features on it, these tagim. So that's unique to your scroll. They don't always do that. You have enlarged letters, such as here, but here you've got the stretched letters that you can see. So they're trying to... Another enlarged letter. See the aleph there, the small letter that's... The scratching that you see is because that sheen surface is just, it can scratch like that, and that's all. It's unintentional. You can see the dots here that line up with the lines that I was telling you about. And they even do one down here. So they've got the columns all marked out with this. All right. The Gimel there in the middle, the large letter. All right. Another special pagination of the priestly blessing. This is an interesting passage. I think you were asking about this. This is in Numbers, and traditionally, this passage was traditionally thought to belong elsewhere in the Torah. The scribes have marked it by creating brackets out of their letter N. And the brackets are placed around the passage, it should be somewhere else in their minds. Let me be very clear. They don't change the passage. They just bracket it. All right? So I told the professors, and hopefully some will implement it for you nice students in here, I would have my students every semester hand copy text of Scripture and tell them if they made no glasses, by candlelight sometimes, and no mistakes. And could you imagine if I went in the middle of that and said, oh, I want this passage over there? They would martyr me with their pens. All right? So the idea, the modern concept of manipulating ancient manuscripts and moving one text to one place and another text to another place and changing this phrase always to that and this name always to that, it screams that the person is not familiar with how manuscripts are written and made. They have no familiarity with it all. If I could just have you think about this, sometimes it's popularly thought manuscripts are created, boy, that's a time of susceptibility and error and things like that. In fact, the manuscript process solidified the text because you can't change it around. Not in the way you think you can. You can't do it. It can't be manipulated. It's canonized when it's written and takes on a format and structure that holds its own and is very difficult to change, as we'll see. All right, so while for centuries they believe this passage goes elsewhere, it stays there with brackets, and they don't change it. So, all right. Oh, this is an interesting one. So, shalom. This is an exegetical device. Here you have with this letter, it's split in half. Now, you all, in looking at the text, you might think, oh, it's chipped ink or it's this or that. You pay close attention to every aspect of the letters, whether they're large or they're small or they're brackets or they're this or they're that. In this case, this is done because the passage was thought that the piece that was being offered in this context was a disingenuous piece. And because of that, they're indicating it to the reader by splitting the letter. Isn't that interesting? So these little tiny things. All right. I'm not. Yeah, please do.
Bottom left of the slide.
Yeah.
Looks like you got two bobs that are connected with a.
Oh.
What's going on there? It's shown up a number of places.
Yeah. Well, they're not vowels. It's a different letter, and there are different ways historically of writing this letter, and this is an unusual way of seeing it. Usually, this is indicated by an earlier handwriting or text, but here it's not. Anybody hazard a guess of what letter that is? Yeah. So there are two different ways of writing it. That's a good question. All right. Okay, so here you have the Ten Commandments again. Deuteronomy. You have the Shema, right? Is that what I see? So, hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one Lord. And this is always kind of highlighted by enlarging the last letter of the first word and the last letter of the last word. And so that's what you have there. This is the curses of Ebal, and they're kind of laid out in their own way as well. And that's what you have there. More dotted letters. I see an enlarged Lamed here in the middle. There's the Song of Moses is laid out in 4 thin columns at the end of Deuteronomy. Not with your Torah, but it was required of all males, according to later tradition, rabbinic tradition, to write the Torah. Well, few could spend the time and the resources or had the expertise to do it. So what you do, what is done, it's still done today, is a person or a group of people would hire someone to do it for them. And then the person who's hiring the scribe would write either both and or the first line of the Torah or the last line. And you'll see very different handwriting at the front or the end. Not on yours. It's the same person all the way through. And so we're commissioned by a synagogue or something. Okay. This is the last line. And same handwriting. Now, some of the crowns are connected and are very beautiful. And again, we don't know exactly why, but you'll see this feature as well in places. Every book is introduced by 4 blank lines. Now, technically, it could be fewer or more, but 4 is the standard that I always see, and so that's what you have. And you see this Aleph here. There are, I've mentioned to you, corrections, and sometimes there's no mark here in the column at all, but here clearly they miss a word. And so they've scrunched it in there, and it's the same scribe. It's the same hand. So he caught whatever he did here, he caught it. And that's what you have going on there. And you're going to see things like that, and they're all indicated in the database for you. Extended letters, we talked about those. That's an erasure, I see. So in here, there's an erasure that's made, and you can see it. It'd be easier with the texture, even down to here. The texture of the skin, you'd be able to see that easier. Here, clearly, somebody a little bit later has made a correction with a different handwriting. All right? Again, these things don't make us nervous. We embrace them and say, wow, look at the activity of the community to make sure that the scripture was right. I see the lines on the divine name. See indications of those. They're intentionally especially marked to draw highlight to it. You do have a number of these stamps throughout on the back side. See the pinholes running down the middle very clearly and the lines associated with them. Here is a replacement panel, so you don't have the same lines here. Now, for them, whatever damage happened to this panel, probably water damage or something like that, maybe the ink chipped away, whatever, they had to go and find another Torah made with the same number of lines per column. Everything had to line up just right in order to fit it in. So they took it off the one Torah that was Pasul, and they put it on this one, and they made sure it was right so they wouldn't have to copy it over again. So you have one panel, and these, see here, these are marks for corrections that are here in the columns. Almost done. More notes on the top. That's what the backside looks like. Stitching. I did tell the group earlier, our conservator that works with us has gone through, and every skin has been reinforced and stitched again so that it's strong and bound together well and will last you well, and you'll be able to get great use of it. Gotta see here, somebody's made a mark here for some kind of correction here, but whenever they erased it away, they must have gone too deep. And so, consequently, we look at the back, and they had to put a patch in. All right, so they put a patch in to replace it. And I've seen some that have had hundreds of patches in them. Bethel College and Seminary has a Torah that has the corrections above the lines. And I think they have 3,000 corrections in theirs. So these things, they're not unique. Each scroll is unique. But they all tell the same story of an arduous commitment to the accurate transmission of the Bible. Not done by magic, done by hard work. And patching of the top, these things get... Okay, it looks like that brings us to the end of it. Those show you some of the unique features. I told this to the last group. The layout to Exodus 15 with the Dead Sea Scrolls, called the scrolls from the Judean desert, we don't have a whole Torah, but we have bits and pieces. And we actually have a bit from Exodus 15. And the bit, when you look at it from Exodus 15, it's laid out exactly like your Exodus 15 is laid out. So that means the scribes are transmitting the text in the same way over the centuries. So not only is the word accurately transmitted, actually the format and the mode by which it's transmitted is the same. It's a powerful thing, and there are many other examples of that with scribal techniques. I would urge you with this scroll, as you love to study it and gain a passion for it and understand it more deeply, that when you look at it, you understand you're looking at a trajectory of several thousand years of tradition that's embodied in this scroll that dates to 1860 to 1890. But don't discard this as saying, oh, it's almost modern. It is the embodiment of ancient scribal practices that go back as early as we can go back. And by the way, we could go through the Leningrad Codex, Aleppo, and all to show the same kinds of patterns that are done with this. So what a great heritage that God has blessed you with, and you'll be able to use in your classrooms, and I hope inspire your faith and give you a deeper appreciation as to how His Word was preserved over time and preserved for us. And preserved, hello, this was not done by Christian scribes. This was done by Jewish scribes, all right? We have a faith that is embedded in Judeo-Christianity, an understanding of Judaism. And these things God used to preserve. We could have a fun time contrasting Christian scribal practices with Jewish scribal practices. It was very, very interesting, the whole process and understanding it. By the way, some of the early Christian texts of the Gospels and all were likely copied by pagans because the Christians knew they would do a good job. They knew how to copy texts, and they had practices to make sure they were done right. Next to the Bible, the most frequently copied book, we don't have numbers on the Quran, but the most frequently copied book from the ancient world is Homer's Iliad. Homer's Iliad, when the text is compared, 95% accurate. That's awesome. The Bible is over 98%. That's even more awesome. But there are practices in place where these people had this down to a science in how they went about doing it with great care. And I hope that you'll see that as you encounter it. Of the thousands of scrolls I've been blessed to look at in the midst of things, I'm only aware of one off the top of my head where on the back of it the person's name was indicated, the scribe. It's called a colophon. That's something that Christian scribes did more. They like to talk about what they did, and the Bible is kind of like a relic that way, and they put their name, and it would say, pray for me. One of the manuscripts on exhibit with us in Moscow, is a manuscript of some of St. Augustine's works. And the reason I selected them is because St. Augustine quotes from Scripture 40,000 times. And the work that's in this manuscript is on the canon and things. It's just an awesome work. He wrote it. He's got his handwriting at the end. He says, "Pray for me, a humble sinner, Augustine of Hippo." And there it is. You see, Christians did that, where you're not going to have it with the Jewish scribe. You've got to encounter him as you look at the text and try to understand it. But a common colophon, and I'll open it up to questions. A common colophon, which is like a signing off statement, by Christian scribes when they finished writing Scripture was this: "O reader, take note. While the hand that copied this text rots in the grave, the word copied lives forever." And I think that's awesome. So that's what you have here with this wonderful legacy that this gracious donor has given to you. And I hope that it's a great blessing to you. I hope this little presentation just gives you a better understanding of what you're getting and some of the features and all. And I'm sure that your professors and staff here will run with it and make great use of it. What kind of questions do you have? Yes?
You mentioned the Leningrad Codex. It's the oldest complete book form of the Old Testament that we have available from 1000
In Hebrew.
In Hebrew, from roughly 1008. All of our scholarly editions of the Old Testament are based off of that manuscript, or the most of them. My question is, here we're looking at a scroll that had, before it was decommissioned, 60, 80 years of usage.
At least, yeah.
And the community was correcting all that time. When we look at something like the Leningrad Codex, and we say 1008, AD 1008, I mean, that's what I've been told is when
Yeah,
it
there
was,
are two dates in
done.
it, yeah.
Do we see evidence in a work like that?
Yes.
Of also the updating afterwards, after that date, or is that the date of decommissioning?
No, there's a constant engagement with the text to make it right. Now, making it right might not mean always making it right. Like you have with, let's go even earlier, with Codex Sinaiticus. You have all the different, they've gone through with all the different correctors and all the different things, and they're dated, and who's putting in what where, and it's a kind of an organic faith project where they're engaged with it and trying to make sure. Now, most of these 960 in your case are letters chipping and things like that. There are times where, like, the shapes of letters become no longer fashionable and they change them. The rabbis get uptight about that. But you could see with some, there are actually lines where they missed a line, they missed words. And it's not a rabbi doing textual criticism that finds this. It's reading it in their liturgy. And somebody, a young boy, getting up saying, "Wait, that's not right. It's not agreeing with what I'm reading." And they hover over it and close it up and get it off to be sent. It's an awesome process. But it's a living process. And but it's being done as they're using it in the liturgy. They're not reading it other than that. So, and yeah, there's evidence for that as well in the Leningrad Codex and the Aleppo Codex, and so. Yes. Yeah, that wasn't beyond the monks, the Christian monks, but I think it's unique to how they have a written culture like this still, and how it's used in the synagogue, and how it's studied, and how it needs to be made sure that all the letters and everything, there's a very close attention to the text as a result of that. And the net result is you've got a perfect text. It's awesome. Yeah, because you know what? When I was in school, I was converted in the university. I was an athlete at a Division I school. And I hoped to think, that the scribe sat down and did it and got it right the first time, and it was perfect, and that God supervened in that process, and I rested in that. You could see learning about these things might cause you to be, have a disquieted faith or to be a little uneasy. But shouldn't at all. We should be encouraged by it before God and say, awesome, God. Look, if God had chosen to preserve his word as was given in kryptonite boxes surrounded by the mightiest of angels, we would worship them like a golden calf. But instead, he humbles us through this process to be broken before him, to require us to learn Hebrew, to require us to learn Greek, to require us to pray, to be chasten what we learn to his glory, and to stand in awe that this is how it's done. We can be encouraged by it all. Yeah.
Did you say of the 20,000 or so Torah scrolls in existence, this is one of the oldest?
No. Yeah. The oldest one published is an Italian scroll that was released. There was information was released on a couple of years ago. But there's another scroll in the collection that this came from that was radiocarbon dated about a year and a half ago. And radiocarbon dates within the historical period that we're dealing with. When you do good tests at great institutions and pay a lot of money and they take a lot of time, are very valuable. And this radiocarbon dated this particular scroll about 100 years earlier. But the 1200s is about the earliest that we have with the Torah scroll. A lot of reasons for that. But this would then, of the 20,000, most of those are 20th century scrolls.
Most are newer than this.
Yes, yeah, that's what I said probably. Yeah. So anytime you go back before World War II and it survived and all, is fantastic. Yes?
Why did the Jewish community maintain scrolls after the Codex was established?
Yeah. Or the printing press.
Or the printing press?
Right. Well, I think I could call my friend and he would tell you. So I will convey what he would say. God has privileged us to be conveyors of his truth, to sacrifice our lives, to learn how to carefully, letter by letter, do this rather than to entrust it to a mechanical process. That it's a much higher calling that they see that they're engaged in. And by the way, I had for one exhibit I did for the what is now the Museum of the Bible, I had a gallery that had famous typos in Bibles. And you all are probably aware of the 1631 King James, the Wicked Bible, thou shalt commit adultery. The typesetter, either intentionally or accidentally, we all know how many texts have you sent out that you wished you could retrieve because of a knot missing in it or something like that. So he would point to something like this, my scribe friend, and say, entrust to the mechanical process a mistake like that, and it's done by the thousands. You see. So now with the Codex versus the book, a brief comment on that. Everything was done in scroll form that was written until about 100 years before Jesus. And then a format was invented based on wax books that they had and bound together. Wood with wax, a slip coat, and they'd write on it, and they thought, gee, this would be a way to... And so they invented this idea of the Codex. The earliest surviving codices, codex texts that come from a book, are Christian. There are no classical texts that date earlier than the Christian texts. And however, there are very early texts of the New Testament, ones that aren't even tabulated for scholars to know yet. They're not published yet at all, that are on scroll as well. But very, very early format was, very early on, was the codex format. And I was lecturing in Charlotte, and a very prominent New Testament scholar who, a conservative New Testament scholar, who I would never academically stand in his shadow. I said something just about this, about the codex. And he groaned. He went, "Ugh," because he had been teaching that everything was done early, was in scroll format, and that the thing was later. And afterwards, I took him over and just showed him papyri, several, that were early 2nd century papyri, that were written in book format. The Christian scribes took on this new element of writing in a codex form. And they did, we think, because it was more economical, it could be protected, it could be hidden, it didn't look classical, and it didn't look Jewish. That said, obviously in Revelation you still have scrolls rolled out with seals and things. This is late 1st century, the early text of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1, which people have been rumoring about. I've worked with it twice, is codex format. And it may be as early as 70 AD. So 70 to 110, 120 is what the paleographer that we work with places it at. Another early text of the epistles of Paul are dated now. I won't say the passage just because I don't want to evoke speculation on it, but it's dated somewhere by a paleographer, world-renowned paleographer, between 120 and like 160. So very, very early, massive amount of text. Also a codex. So Christians popularized this idea of the codex. By the Middle Ages, Jews began to use that practice as well. But it was something that was early on, just a kind of a Christian adoption from the classical world that they took over. But the Torah was never done that way. It was always done in scroll form.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carroll.
Sure.